it's terrific to be here, and we've got an AusAID sign up there, so we're very proud to be able to support the work that the UN Association of Australia does, and particularly this function. I'm really pleased that there are several AusAIDers in the audience, and that at least one of them will present during the conference on his experience as an Australian Youth Ambassador for Development. And it's also terrific to be here so soon after the tremendous victory in the UN Security Council vote. And you might have seen a lot of commentary that's talked about whether or not AusAID's budget has been skewed, I think not to put too fine a point on it, so that we could buy votes and get people to support us in the Security Council campaign. And of course I'm going to say we didn't actually use the aid budget to buy votes. But what we did do, and I think very legitimately, was to use and highlight to people the effectiveness of our aid program and the quality of our aid program as one of the indications of the capability and values that Australia will bring as a member of the Security Council, just as we highlighted Australia's historic role as a very generous contributor to peacekeeping missions and our broader diplomatic work. So we're very proud that we played a role in securing some of the support that saw Australia have such a resounding victory in New York a couple of weeks ago. And Robert talked today, and I thought really interestingly, about some of the challenges that will face Australia as a member of the Security Council, but also some of the opportunities that we have. And many of the issues will, of course, focus on conflict and conflict in developing countries, humanitarian disasters, and sometimes humanitarian disasters that result from conflict, and that's too often the case, but issues like peacekeeping, peace building, pandemics, Robert mentioned water, population, the issue of counter-radicalisation, and the link between poverty and security in countries like Afghanistan and Somalia is very, very clear. AusAID plays a role in all of these areas, and increasingly so. So we see ourselves as being a very significant contributor to the next 2 years of Australia being on the Security Council. Of course, our colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade will, as is properly the case, will lead, but we will be supporting them, because if you look at the pattern of work of the Security Council, about 80% of it relates to Africa, and all of the countries in Africa face significant development challenges. Our role will be to provide advice on those development issues. And our work at AusAID involves us interacting with a very large number of UN agencies. First, as an increasing donor, as Russell has said, our budget has grown, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But just as importantly, using the growth in our budget and the bigger contributions we're making to UN agencies to be more influential in the way in which they do their work. We have multi-year funding arrangements with most of the peak UN agencies that would come to mind. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, which leads the coordination of UN and international responses to disasters and humanitarian emergencies, the World Food Programme, and UN Women, just to name a few. And that's a good segue into what I really want to talk about today, is how the aid program in Australia has grown, and the way it has moved from really, I think, the sidelines of government to a much more central role. And I'll talk about 3 issues that I think lie behind the shift: a growing understanding of the impact and role of aid, the particular geography of Australia's neighbourhood, and the increasing confidence in the capacity of AusAID itself. But a little bit of a history lesson to start with. Not that long ago, AusAID was an organisation of a few hundred people with a budget just over $1 billion. In 2000, our budget was $1.6 billion, a lot of money, and our ODA to GNI ratio, that is the standard measure that's applied internationally to look at the relative efforts of developed countries through their aid programs, was around 0.24%, which put us very much in the bottom half of OECD donors, and our staff at AusAID was well under 1,000 people. Our programs at the time were largely standalone projects, and many of those were managed and delivered by what we call managing contractors. That is, companies that we would give a contract to. They would then assemble a team of Australian technical experts, and they'd go off and implement the programs or the projects. And it's fair to say, I think in those days we were seen as peripheral to a lot of the work that government was doing. Aid was seen as a good thing to do, and certainly a worthy thing to do, but not necessarily as a core part of Australia's broader international engagement strategy. And the change and expansion of the role of AusAID in the aid program really began in 2005, when the then Howard government announced a doubling of the aid program by 2010. And this was in response to a number of different developments, including responding to the impact of the tsunami in Southeast Asia in 2004. And you might recall that the Howard government offered Indonesia alone $1 billion in assistance to recover from the tsunami. We'd been through the problems faced with East Timor's independence. We've seen the collapse of the Solomon Islands. We'd seen the conflict in Bougainville. And on an international level, we'd seen the problems, both security and humanitarian, that had been generated by failed states like Somalia and Afghanistan. And this really drew into sharp relief for the international community the link between poverty and insecurity. And we also saw growing concerns about global pandemics. The SARS epidemic, climate change became a much more prominent issue on the agenda, as did things like the indebtedness of poor countries and, importantly, food security. The Millennium Development Goals had been agreed and commitments had been made by developed countries, including Australia, to meet those goals by 2015. And the broader backdrop of international developments also influenced, I think, the growth of the aid program in Australia and in all other developed countries. In particular, the rise of the influence of developing countries. Robert talked about the rise of the influence of non-state actors, and I certainly agree with the points he made there. But in a world that's no longer a bipolar world following the end of the Cold War, we've seen groups of developing countries like the G77 and more lately the countries known as the BRICS, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, have a much greater influence on a whole range of global issues. And of course, as developing countries, they want development very much in the centre of the things that the UN and other international organisations are dealing with. So over the past decade, AusAID's been asked to provide advice to government on development policy and to manage Australia's aid program in all of these areas. And we do that as part of a whole of government effort, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But we've certainly had to broaden our skills and strengthen our management, and in particular sharpen our ability to achieve and to demonstrate that we are achieving better results. And the growth in the policy agenda for AusAID has been matched by the growth in our budget, which now runs at about $5.2 billion, or around 0.35% of our gross national income. And in terms that normal human beings can understand, that means for every $100 that Australia earns in income, we spend 35 cents on international aid. It puts us pretty much at the average now of OECD donors as a percentage of our GNI, but we're rocketing up the table in terms of our dollar volumes. Interestingly, we now spend about 1.3% of the federal government's budget on aid, and the government is committed to growing the budget even further to meet a target of 0.5% of GNI by 2015-16. It's interesting when people talk about the growth in the aid program, and there are certainly commentators who've been very critical of the growth in the aid program. But when you test with the public what they think about growth in the aid program, you get some interesting answers. And the Lowy Institute, in its annual independent poll a couple of years ago, asked people what they thought the level of Australian aid was as a percentage of our overall budget. And the average was 16%. We spend 1.3%. So it's interesting the difference between the perception and the reality. In fact, there's been similar exercises done in the United States where people come up with the same kind of answers. They think something like 15 to 20% is spent. In the US, it's less than 1% of their national budget is spent on aid. So my colleagues in USAID were thinking of running a campaign in Congress to limit spending on the USAID budget to 2%, because it would see them double their budget. But our work is done in a wide variety of environments, and we've certainly broadened our program now outside of our traditional focus in the Asia Pacific to include increasingly large programs in South Asia, so countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and particularly Pakistan and Afghanistan. Our staff has grown. We're now around 2,000 staff, and about half of those staff work overseas in around 40 posts. And most of those posts, as you could imagine, are in the more difficult parts of the world, ranging from a half a dozen African posts through to places like Kabul, Islamabad, and Tarin Kot within Afghanistan itself. And there are many other differences that have occurred in AusAID over the last few years as we have grown, but by far the biggest difference in my view is the range of cross-government policy issues in which AusAID is now engaged. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about our work in Afghanistan as an example of this. In Afghanistan, we work at three levels. We work firstly at the level of Uruzgan province, and you'll know that Uruzgan province is where Australia has deployed its military contingent. There are about 1,500 Australian troops in Uruzgan at any one time. Well, AusAID has about half a dozen development advisors working alongside the Australian Defence Force and our DFAT colleagues. And our work involves working with the provincial and district authorities to build their capacity to improve basic services. So when we arrived in Uruzgan province about 2.5 years ago, only 30% of the positions in the provincial government were actually occupied. And most of them were occupied by officers who were illiterate or corrupt or both. And there were very few people who had any literacy skills or any administrative skills in the provincial government. So we took the approach of not that we were doing capacity building, that we were actually creating capacity, and we've done some very innovative things by training people in very basic civil service tasks so that they can run an administration and hopefully over time improve their capacity to provide basic services to the population. But we also build health clinics in the province. We work on developing rural infrastructure, particularly roads, and helping farmers to increase their yields and hopefully move away from the production of poppies and involvement in the drug trade. And this is, of course, very tough work in an extremely challenging security environment, but it's an essential part of Australia's and international efforts to build a stable and secure Afghanistan. And there's broad recognition that high levels of development assistance will be essential if Afghanistan is to improve its living standards and ultimately become a peaceful and stable society. In addition to working at the local level, we work at the national level in Kabul. And in Kabul, we manage relationships with the key national ministries like finance, health and education. And finance is a particularly important area for an aid agency like us because nothing happens unless you have a public financial management system that allows you to move resources around. So you wouldn't think accountancy is an area where aid agencies would actually focus a lot of time and energy, but our public financial management experts are some of the most important people who work in the organisation because they either create the pipelines or unclog the pipelines that allow resources to flow out of capitals and into the areas where people live. We provide a very high level of support for the national government in Afghanistan in the development and implementation of national programs that are focused on areas like poverty reduction or building the quality and reach of education facilities. We're also helping Afghanistan start the process of developing its own natural resources. It's probably fair to say to be a brave investor who would invest in the Afghan mining industry at the moment, but Afghanistan will have to generate its own revenue if it's going to succeed as a viable state. And at the moment, about 90% of Afghanistan's GDP comes through foreign aid or the spending associated with foreign military forces there. And we're working with the Afghanistan government to try and ensure that the 2014 presidential elections are credible. Many people see the 2014 elections as being perhaps the most important issue that Afghanistan will have to deal with over the next couple of years. And if those elections were seen not to be credible, we could see a very significant deterioration in the situation on the ground just at the time that most of the international military will be moving out of the country. At the international level, we've also played a leading role in the development of what's known as a mutual accountability framework between international donors like Australia and the Afghanistan government. A few months ago, Senator Carr, our Foreign Minister, participated in a conference in Tokyo where the international community agreed to provide Afghanistan with $16 billion worth of aid over the next 4 years. But in return for that, the international community has attached some conditions, and these really relate to things that we want to see in the development of Afghanistan over the next few years. We want to see the progress that's been made in improving the rights of women and girls continue. We want to see ethnic minorities respected in the country and be able to live safely. We want to see Afghanistan tackle issues like corruption, and in that context we want to see Afghanistan commit to free and fair elections in 2014 and beyond. So we played a key role in brokering the agreement and drafting the document that contains the commitments of both the international community and the Afghanistan government. And our work in Afghanistan is having results, albeit from a very, very low base. And to tell you how low the base is in Afghanistan, in Uruzgan where we work, the literacy rate for women is less than 1%, and for men it's less than 10%. So really difficult area. But one of the most extraordinary, in my view, achievements has been the increase in the number of girls in education. In 2008, just 1 million girls were in school. Today, totally, there are 8 million boys and girls in school, and over 2 million of those children are girls. Beyond Afghanistan, AusAID also has a very busy agenda in leading the government's negotiations in a number of important areas. Climate change is an area where we spend an increasingly amount of time, and we lead the negotiations that the government's involved in around the financial transfers from developed countries to developing countries. And just recently, one of our Deputy Directors General, Ewan MacDonald, has been appointed as the co-chair of the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund is going to be the international mechanism through which countries will be assisted, poor countries will be assisted to grow their economies in a sustainable way and to adapt to the major challenges posed by climate change. So just last week in Korea was elected as the host of this new international body, the Green Climate Fund, and of course through our role as a co-chair we will be instrumental in designing the mechanisms that come under the Green Climate Fund. AusAID also coordinates the government's response to international disasters and humanitarian emergencies. And last year we responded to about 30 emergencies, including in the Horn of Africa, where we saw for the first time in many decades famine officially declared by the United Nations. But we've worked in Sudan and southern Sudan, and we also dealt with the humanitarian impacts of the conflict in Libya and other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. This year, we're dealing with the food security and security problems in the Sahel region of Africa. We've been the 5th largest donor so far to crises, and we're also dealing with the ongoing and growing humanitarian crisis resulting from the brutality of the Assad regime in Syria. So we're one of the largest donors to the humanitarian efforts to get assistance to the people in Syria who are suffering so much. Our agenda in AusAID is also matched by an increasing engagement by the Prime Minister Gillard in the aid program, and I saw in your programs the Prime Minister in her message pointed out the role that she's recently taken on as an MDG advocate, as co-chair of the UN Secretary General's MDG advocacy group. And this is a group that is really looking for ideas as to how we can accelerate over the next 36 months just over 36 months, the efforts that we've been making over the last almost 15 years to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And the Prime Minister has singled out 3 particular areas where she's going to focus her energy: gender equality, better education, and combating malaria. And reflecting her passion for the transformative benefits of education, the Prime Minister has been also appointed as a member state champion of the Education First initiative. And this is an initiative spearheaded again by the UN Secretary General to get the last 61 million children into school. So what we're seeing is an aid program that's getting much bigger, much more diverse, and much more central to the government's agenda. And I think there are 3 reasons why this is happening. The first is a growing appreciation of the role and impact of aid in Australia and across the globe. There are many misconceptions about aid. There are those people who look at the huge challenges that still confront developing countries and conclude from that that aid doesn't work. Well, my observations as the head of AusAID over the last 3 years have been quite different. And I've seen many lives saved through timely humanitarian assistance. I mentioned last year the work that we did in the Horn of Africa. Australian assistance provided food aid to just under 8 million people. We were able to provide assistance to treat 370,000 malnourished children, and we immunised 1 million children against measles. In a place closer to home, Papua New Guinea, with our help, we've seen over the last 3 years a dramatic increase in the completion rates of school children by improving the quality and removing school fees. In fact, last financial year, Australian assistance saw over 1 million boys and girls enter school for the first time. In Indonesia, we've recently started implementing a program that has already provided over 400,000 people access to safe drinking water for the first time. And if you could imagine what it's like for the very first time in your life, having a tap in your house that has clean water that you can access anytime you want. Truly life-changing stuff. So I really think the question shouldn't be whether aid works, but rather under what conditions does aid work best? And here I think there's an increasingly, mature appreciation across government to that question. We certainly don't claim in AusAID that aid in and of itself will turn countries into dynamic economies with the resilience to overcome economic shocks and natural disasters. But aid can play a very important catalytic role in promoting development. The former World Bank President, Bob Zoellick, described it as a valuable boost enabling countries to climb the ladder of growth, and I think that's a good description. There's also growing awareness of the timeframes in which aid takes to work. For a time, people looked at countries like China and Korea and thought there was some formula that had been discovered in China and Korea that we could replicate around the world and see similar types of growth and a similar pace of growth. But the reality is that the China experience and the Korean experience are outliers. They're not the mainstream. Development's a long-term process most of the time, and quick wins are rare. So we shouldn't be shocked that after nearly 10 years and many, many millions of dollars of support for our regional assistance mission to Solomon Islands, that Solomon Islands isn't yet challenging Singapore as a regional superpower. It will take another generation to fix the problems in the Solomon Islands. That's not admitting defeat, it's being realistic. And people have actually looked at these issues in an analytical way and done some research on how long would it take a poor country to progress to per capita incomes that were similar to, say, the United States. And the answers are pretty sobering. For a country like Cambodia, if it grew at the average rate it has done since its independence, it would take 2 centuries to get to the current per capita income levels of the United States. And researchers also looked at how quickly developing countries might acquire the level of state capability, say, of a country like Singapore. And at the current rate of progress, the researchers show that fragile and conflict-affected countries like Haiti Afghanistan and Liberia would take several hundred, if not thousands of years to reach the capability of a country like Singapore. And they would even take decades to achieve the level of development that we see today in a country like Bangladesh. So to those who claim that aid doesn't work, I say it does, but it's not a silver bullet. It can't compensate for a lack of political will to change, and it's not going to deliver instant results by itself. I think a second reason why the aid program is growing in importance is simply geography. If you get a map of the world out and you look at where Australia is geographically located, most of our neighbours are developing countries, and we're unique in that position as a major economy and as a major donor. We're the only donor in the world that gives the vast bulk of our assistance to our immediate neighbours. And so our successful support to countries like Indonesia and Papua New Guinea that helps them to build more stable and prosperous nation states is fully in line with Australia's foreign policy and national security interests. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever. We, as I say, are the only developed economy in the world that has as its immediate neighbours a large number of developing countries. And they're not just developing countries. In many cases, they're what's known as fragile states. And when I talk about fragile states, I mean a low-income country that has weak capacity and often weak legitimacy as a state. And that lack of legitimacy leaves citizens vulnerable to a whole range of shocks. And fragile states are not just states like Somalia or the Republic of Congo or Cote d'Ivoire, but they also include countries like Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu and Timor-Leste. In fact, there's about 1.5 billion people on the planet that live in fragile and conflict-affected states, and 12 of Australia's neighbours in the Asia-Pacific are classified as fragile. And one of the defining characteristics of the Australian aid program is that we spend over half of all of our funds in states that are classified as fragile or conflict-affected. In my view, the final and perhaps most critical reason why AusAID has taken a more central role in Australia's international engagement is the growing credibility of our own organisation. We've spent a lot of time over the last 3 years changing the way in which we do our business. We've been reviewed from every possible angle you can think of, including independent reviews, audits, peer reviews by other aid agencies globally. And through all of those processes, we've identified ways in which we've strengthened our management of our budget, of our people, but most importantly, how we've gotten better at designing programs that can achieve good results. Because my biggest challenge is to demonstrate to the taxpayer who funds us, to the Parliament who approves our appropriation, and to the departments of finance and treasury, the forces of darkness to whom we must fight every year for our budget, that we're actually producing results and we're making a difference. And we're not just saying that, we can point to real things that are happening in terms of school enrolments, children being immunised, mothers having babies under the appropriate skilled supervision. And AusAID is probably more scrutinised now than any other area of the Commonwealth Government. And this year, for the first time, we'll be presenting an annual report to Cabinet, which will cover the totality of our work over the last 12 months. And we're the only agency in the Commonwealth that I'm aware of that actually reports to Cabinet each year on every single thing that they do. I also think that our ability to manage the growing budget has been demonstrated to the government and given government confidence to continue to invest in us. And last year we saw a reduction by over 2/3 in the amount of fraud that happened in the aid program. And fraud is something that gets AusAID onto the John Laws program, onto the Alan Jones program, and usually on the front 2 pages of the Daily Telegraph. So we take very seriously these nuts and bolts administrative issues and as part and parcel of our job in building confidence that we can deliver good outcomes at value for money for the taxpayer and for the Parliament. So there is some views of why aid is more important as a part of Australia's international engagement. You're all at the very beginning of your careers as I look out and I see people much younger than myself, and I don't doubt that many of you are thinking about careers in diplomacy. I hope that my outline this afternoon of the Australian Aid Program and its emergence as a key part of the government's broader international engagement strategy will encourage a few of you to think about looking at the sorts of careers that we offer in AusAID. So thank you.